Welcome to the Exchange Wales podcast, a series that explores research and practice sharing, evidence and care experience to build better social care in Wales and beyond.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Exchange Wales podcast. My name is Jeremy Dixon and I'm your host today. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Rich Gator from the Centre for Adult Social Care Research. And Rich has recently published a book called 21st Century Ladz, spelled L-A-D-Z. And he's here today to talk about it with us. So welcome, Rich. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I really enjoyed reading your book, which I've read over the last couple of weeks. And I was just wondering, for the benefits of those who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, can you just give us a quick summary of what it's about?
In basic terms, I suppose the book looks at a group of young men aged 13 to 21, I think it was, from a deprived ex-coal mining valley in the South Wales Valleys. And it essentially explores their attitudes towards education and employment. So, what do they like school? Do they dislike school? What parts of it don't they like? What they want to do for employment? Why they want to do certain forms of employment? And it also looks at their behaviours, and then considers these behaviours in the context of gender and masculinities. And the book is based on my PhD research that involved ethnography, or I suppose maybe simplify that a little bit. People watching, I call systematic people watching. So looking at the patterns of behaviour people engage in and trying to understand why, and then just talking to them, I guess, semi-structured interview, who's talking to them through specific questions and asking them why they wanted to do certain things. And the book kind of brings all that together, I guess, those stories together.
Yeah, thanks. That's really clear. And one of the areas of research you're interested in is around sort of masculinities and gender. So that's something which is spoken about quite often in sociology. But I guess for people who aren't familiar with the sociology literature, they might not really know what we mean when we're talking about masculinities. So could you just give us a bit of an explainer about what that's about?
I'm a bit concerned about how simplified I make this, but I guess kind of masculinities or gender and sex get kind of used interchangeably. But when we're talking about sex, we're talking about biological factors. And when we're talking about gender, we're talking about differences in behaviour that are socially constructed. So how certain ideas of manhood or masculinities are determined by aspects such as media, sport, family, social class, your education, how all those factors converge to influence how you act, how those determine how you act how you think of being a man, essentially. So that's kind of what the ideas of masculinities and genders mean. And I guess some people listening to this might notice that we've used the term masculinity, so I think that's worth going exploring a little bit further. Because when we're talking about how these different factors influence young men's ideas of manhood, we say that there's not one uniform idea of manhood or masculinity. There's different versions, and those are determined by those different influences that I mentioned. So that's why we talk about masculinities rather than masculinities. We would say that there's not one exact version. There's a variety of versions, and I guess those varieties, those different versions of masculinity, are determined by time and space as well. So I guess that's what my book tries to do. It tries to look at kind of these kind of ideas of continuity and change.
Yeah, no, that's really a good explanation, I think. And you bring in your own biography quite a lot in the book, which makes it really interesting to read. And you talk about how you've had quite a lot of jobs. In the book, you kind of talk about finding it difficult to settle at school and having a lot of different careers. So maybe can you just say a little bit about that? Because I think you said that you perhaps struggled at school and then sort of went on to a whole range of jobs before thinking about going into youth work and then actually coming into academia.
Yeah. So I guess the reason why, take it back a bit, maybe the reason why I talk about myself a lot in here, which I've found quite difficult to do actually, and maybe we can get into that, but the reason why I talk about myself is because I'm focusing on a group of marginalised young men. And when we're talking about marginalised young men within sociological terms, we're generally talking about a group of young men that are often associated with a rejection of education and an attraction to manual work. And I guess what some people would call a negative form of masculinity, or what's become termed toxic masculinity, is not a term that we kind of use. Well, it's become more familiar in gender studies, but it hasn't been up till late. But yeah, these young men are associated with that. And, very much that was how my experiences of being a young man was. So, I rejected education. I wanted to do manual work because my father was a carpenter. And that's partly the reason why I rejected education, because I didn't see it as relevant to my future. And because of my rejection of education, I went on to do those manual jobs that you mentioned, such as working in factories and working in, I worked in a supermarket picking home deliveries. Mm-hmm. Just a variety of different low-skilled and precarious forms of employment, because I didn't have those qualifications that would allow me to go on to do better jobs, use that term loosely. And that was it. So I was focusing on young men that were slightly similar to me. So it was partly important for me to talk about my history for my biography, because for integrity reasons, in research terms, because who we are determines how we look at the research subject. So it was important for me to discuss that, and it was also important because obviously I was looking at these young men who were similar to me, and they did engage in lots of behaviours that I did when I was younger. But the equally fascinating thing for me was they engaged in behaviours that I wouldn't have dreamed of doing when I was younger. So it was quite beneficial in lots of ways, that kind of what we call an insider status, I suppose. So, yeah.
And you said at the beginning of that, but you were finding it difficult to write about yourself. So why was that, do you think?
It just feels slightly egotistical, doesn't it? Embedding yourself into the research. And it was only because my supervisor really encouraged me to kind of explore my history and to write about it more, that gave me confidence to do it. I said it just feels really egotistical. But I guess what my supervisor said, that this kind of work, the focus on marginalised young men is normally done by academics who've gone through a standard trajectory of education. So they've done their A levels, they've gone to university, and then they've gone back to look at these marginalised young men that rejected education. So my focus is slightly unique. I'm not saying no one out there has done it. I haven't come across it yet, and maybe there is someone out there. So, but it is slightly unique, so it offers a unique focus. So, yeah, I was encouraged to do it. But there was also psychological and emotional difficulties of doing that as well. So, because you've got to delve into your past, haven't you, and the reason why you did things. And as I said, some of the behaviours that they engaged in were quite contradictory to how I remember my past. So, I had to explore, what was the past that I remembered? Was there a true reflection of my past? And so.
No, I think it works in the book, and it makes it a lot easier to read than some academic books based on people's PhD thesis can be. So it's really interesting to me, I think. And you talk about coming from the valleys, and just bearing in mind that people might be listening to this from outside of Wales. Mm-hmm. So that means something to both of us, being based in a Welsh university. But can you just say a bit about what the valleys is and the significance of that?
Yeah, so, as you rightly say, at the beginning of the book, I document the boys, and I offer the reader a glimpse into these young men, so their stories are more open, so the reader gets a better picture of them. And then I also document myself, and I just said I refer to myself as a valley boy. And I guess that for me, the valley boy is about growing up in an area, it's an ex-coal mining area, where those traditional ideas of manhood, were the foundation for me and many people from my generation, that, men should be tough, they should be stoic, they shouldn't express emotions. And, many people in my community, that's how we grew up. And, there's part in the book where I talk about the Square Boys, and they were a group of young men in my community that who exemplified those ideas. They stood on the street corners. They were often gone to fights, and for people like me that didn't have avenues of education and employment, they were kind of our idols in some ways.
Yeah, no, I get that. And it's interesting to see these different types of people who exist within communities and to hear those kind of different labels, but also, as you do in the book, to sort of show how some of those behaviours and groupings have changed over time.
Yeah, that's exactly what the title of the book suggests, like it's continuity and change. So I just go back to again, a lot of these boys, so they were engaged in criminal behaviour, and I'm not proud of my behaviour. That's the way I'm not proud of my behaviour, but I'm honest about my behaviour. And these are kind of behaviours that I was involved in when I was younger. And the young men, the lads, as I termed them, were on first name terms with the police. But they also, as I said, engage in behaviours that I wouldn't dreamed of engaging in, and they would have potentially made me ostracised in my community. So,
can you tell us about what some of those would be, for example?
Yeah, one of the key aspects of for want of a better word, that absolutely blew my mind was their greeting practice. So when I was younger, the greeting practice was, all right, but. And for people who don't know, the term but in the valleys is used as a friendly term. It's okay, buddy. So we've shortened it to buddy. And it'd be a nod of the head, or, and at the most, it'd be a shake of the hand, but I don't really remember that much. But these young men, they were comfortable hugging each other. So they'd come into the centre and they would, hug each other. They'd do what we call a man hug, which is kind of shoulder and chest together. So it wasn't a complete, really affectionate hug, but there was still some form of intimacy there between two males, and it wasn't something that I would have done in my days, because it would just been seen as feminine behaviour, and it wasn't deemed appropriate behaviour in the era that I grew up with. So, as I said, on one end of the spectrum, these young men were engaged in crime and drug taking, and as I said, some of the behaviours I engaged in when I was younger, but then they were equally engaged in these behaviours that were equally, as I said, I wouldn't have dreamed of engaging in.
Yeah, so I guess what you're noticing really is that I suppose, to put it in simple terms, what it means to be a man in that area has kind of changed or evolved over time.
Yeah.
And you're noticing those differences having grown up in a kind of previous era.
Yeah.
And I wonder, I know the answer to this because I've read the book, but did you talk to them a bit about those sort of differences or how things have changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I asked them, explicitly why they hugged each other, because it was just blew my mind so much. I was like, because I wanted to confirm that actually what I was seeing is real. And I just, it might be hard for the listener to understand, but for me, it was just so different to everything that I knew as a young man growing up. I almost felt sometimes that they were actually putting it on as a show for me, and so I had to interrogate or ask them somewhat, and they just explained to me that that those ideas of hugging each other had become the norm in society. It was acceptable to be able for men to hug each other, and they talked about how footballers do it, and different forms of music, and there's a part in the book where. It was another fascinating part with me where I talk about how two of these young men who were right on the margins, they were on first name terms with the police, but they demonstrated to me how it's difficult to explain without reading it, but how they explained to me how the old ways that I knew as being a man, so shaking hands, were no longer how they did it, and yet they were happy to hug each other. So yeah, I guess that's where the book goes. It talks about how I said ideas of manhood change through time, but how some ideas that I knew were still holding true, but yet because of the place they live and certain prominent members, but yet equally wider culture had kind of changed their ideas of manhood as well.
We provide free, high-quality webinars, resources, and events for social care practitioners and researchers. You can find out more information and register for upcoming events on our website, exchangewales.org.
In the book, you are basing your observations in a youth centre, and you talk in the book about how initially you had this aspiration to be a youth worker, partly because you worked as a park keeper and you'd enjoyed having a relationship with some of the young men in the area. But you got into academia instead. And interestingly, in the book, you kind of start off as an observer in this youth club, but then kind of move on to a point at which, because they're short on numbers, essentially, they ask you to kind of be a youth worker in the centre. So what were your experiences of kind of acting as a youth worker there? And how did you find it, going into youth work at that time?
Again, I'd probably give a better example. It was a really difficult experience for me. So there's one young man I talk about in the book. His name's Stan, and he kind of exemplifies this marginalised status of young men. Again, in some ways he does, and in other ways he doesn't. But just for simplified terms. And when I moved into this role, I can't remember what term in the book, but as an acting youth worker, I had to manage his behaviour as you would as a youth worker in the youth centre. And, there's, as I talk about, there's two young men playing pool at the time, and they're happily playing pool. And Stan walks in on them while they're playing pool. And Stan is not a big lad, but he's formidable in his presence, and he's known to be a tough man among the young men. And he essentially takes the pool cue off the young man who's playing pool, and he starts sporadically hitting pool balls around the table. And he's in danger of hurting himself. He's in danger of hurting the youth centre. So I have to manage Stan's behaviour. So I ask him to stop misbehaving, and he swears at me. I use please because I know he's got problems with authority. And again, he swears at me again. And I'm sat there, and I talk about it in the book, and I'm sat there for quite a while now, just knowing that I've got to throw Stan out of the youth centre, because the youth centre works on a kind of what we call a two-strike rule. So you give the young person a warning, and then on the second warning, you chuck them out. So I'd given him one warning at the point, and he still wouldn't listen. And I knew if I potentially chucked him out, then I might alienate him from the research, and I knew he was really important. And I was sat there for ages thinking about, why does Stan not listen to me? I'm a Valley's boy, I'm a working class young man, similar to them. I share similarity to these young men, but yet for some reason he's not listening to me, and I'm questioning my identity. Have I lost that Valley boy's working class identity? Have I become, this middle class academic that kind of ostracized these young men? And it was really difficult. And there's lots of parts of that in the book that I document. And again, it goes back to the point where that was part of the difficulties when they're talking about emotions as a man that exemplifies some of these ideas of masculinity. It was quite difficult to talk about those parts. But equally, I wanted to give the reader a real glimpse into how the difficulties of being an insider researcher, and kind of difficulties that I faced working with these young men, and really bring them right into the story of these young men and my story, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think you do that really well. As I was reading it, I was thinking it's really interesting to hear about your accounts as a researcher, but you also talk about the role that the youth workers have, and some discussion around the workers about how best to sort of interact with the young men. So if you were kind of trying to summarise it, what would you say that the aims of that youth club were? What were they kind of trying to do, or what were they trying to provide?
I guess that youth centre, and still does in some ways, tries to provide a provision for young men that are growing up in an impoverished valley that hasn't got all the facilities that a more affluent area have, and it tries to offer them, access to things such as, it offers a pool table, it offers gaming, and all these things that some of these young men wouldn't have. And maybe some listeners won't quite understand this, but there's young men in that area that haven't got access to the internet because, they are impoverished. And, these are the area that I did my research is one of the most impoverished in Wales. So that area, that's what that community centre tries to do. But equally, there was and still is some really good youth workers in that youth centre as well that do challenge these young men's behaviours. And so, as I talk about in the book, again, I'm going to probably keep saying that all the way through, sorry, but yeah, these some of the young men do use homophobic language. So, but the youth workers challenge those kind of views as well. So yeah, I guess that youth centre is just trying to offer those young men a place where they can feel comfortable and where they can engage in activities and try and enhance their life chances, I guess, without trying not to use an academic term, but yeah, make their life better, and I suppose create an environment that kind of challenges some of those negative behaviours, but equally offers them a space to grow and be.
Yeah, and I guess growth and how people progress is one of the key themes in your book, isn't it? So you're talking about people's employment prospects in a lot of the book. And one of the people that you use, an academic who's written in the past, is somebody called Paul Willis. And you use his work to sort of show the differences between kind of then and now. Can you just say a little bit about who he is and what his work was about?
Yeah, so Willis is kind of the foundational text, I suppose, on the research topic, or one of the foundational texts, I suppose, on the topic that I'm looking at. So he did a study in the 1970s, looking at a group of working class young men, and he often gets associated with this group of marginalised young men, or he terms the lads with an S as well, which is why I use the Z to create that distinction. But he also looks at these what he calls Euros as well, that are working class young men that have got kind of aspirations, middle class aspirations, as he talks about. But the prominent group is the lads in the book, and they kind of, as I've talked about, they reject education. The lads, they want to do manual work, and that partly comes from the influence of their fathers, the community, and these are, they inherit these ideas that this is what a real man looks like, that a real man doesn't do what they term as pen pushing. So they don't do paperwork, they don't engage in paper, they go out and they work in certain masculine manual forms of work. So they don't see education as beneficial to their future, and they reject that idea of meritocracy. So the idea that if you work hard in education, then you will get a good job. They don't buy into that. They see it as kind of a myth. So yeah, they don't buy into that. And I guess Willis kind of says it kind of they kind of create their own downfall in some ways. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the idea. And I guess the idea why I used that book then is because that's become the foundational text, and it's the one that everyone goes to. So I wanted to create this kind of baseline. So if that's how everyone understands how these young group of men, were, so what did that similar group of young men look like now? Hopefully that makes sense to the listener. Yeah. So that's kind of the reason why I've used that text.
So when you were doing your own research, what were the differences that you saw in the lads you were observing?
So I guess it's three major parts of the book. Firstly, let's go to the education part. So this group of young men we'd associate them with almost a total rejection of education. There's some nuances in different parts of research, but we would associate them with a rejection of education. But these young men, they didn't totally reject education. They adopted what I refer to as a pragmatic approach to education. So they selectively engage in subjects that they think are relevant to their future, whilst rejecting others. So a particularly good example in the book is one talks about RE or history or one of them two, and he says, why do I need that knowledge? It's not relevant to me in everyday life. But he said, maths is relevant to me. So if I go down the shop and I give someone a £10 note, I need to know how much change they're going to give me. And he said that education part is relevant to me in life, but it's also relevant to me being a plumber, whereas I don't need RE to be a plumber. So yeah, they selectively engage in education. And then, so what we're seeing is the continuity and change here, I guess. So they partially reject education, but they equally engage in it. In terms of employment, some of the young men did have aspirations to do manual work, which was the result of family influences and a link to masculinity. But equally, there's what I talk about as being a rupturing process. So certain life influences have changed some of the men's attitudes to what is real forms of employment for men. One wants to be a paramedic, one wanted to be a cook, and one wanted to be work in the media or something like that. There were specific influences. And I guess the last part is the masculinities aspect, where, as I said, something partially engaged in these kind of negative or toxic forms of masculinity, or what I would term hypermasculinity, but they equally engaged in softer expression. So they hugged each other and they talked about mental health problems. Just all things that we don't associate with this group that I didn't do, and equally not reflected in the literature on these young men. So I talk about this amalgamation or amalgamated form of masculinity, where these two forms of masculinity fuse together to create this amalgamation of masculinity.
Yeah, and I think when I was reading it, I had my sort of social work head on to some degree, and I was thinking, well, what kind of messages would this give to people who are working in the social care sector, or how might they learn from this? And I guess there's two things that came up in my mind. So one of them was about the kind of going into different forms of work. So the social care sector often has difficulty recruiting men, doesn't it? And some of the young men that you were speaking to were talking about their feelings towards going into sort of care work or similar types of work. So what kind of issues came up there, and how might it inform, I suppose, people's recruitment practices who are, like working in a social care office, or, for example?
What was interesting for me is like the influences on these young men, so they talk about family influences, they talk about, these ideas of manhood. There was equally, these different aspects that they kind of changed their ideas of what manhood would be. And I guess my call to arms at the end of the book, if that's the right word, is that these young men are changing. There's changes in their ideas. There's changes in ideas of employment, education, and masculinities, and then thinking about what we can do to foster those changes. And I guess from a recruitment angle, what I'm trying to say is, like, how can we look to foster these changes? We need to delve into more about how these changes are coming about, and look at how we can foster them. Because as I talk about in the book, when we look at the future of work, we see potential demise of certain forms of manual work, and we see an increase in those care jobs that you talked about. And I think hopefully that my findings show that there's potential for these young men to go into these forms of jobs, but yet we need to have some targeted intervention that kind of helps these young men and shows them that there's different options available to them.
And reading the findings of the book, it doesn't seem that all of the young men you spoke to kind of wrote off care work as something that wasn't something that men should do or was feminine. So is there a way of making that kind of work appealing to people, do you think?
Oh, yeah, a few of the young men and parts of it are positive about care work. I think they talk about working. I showed them a picture of a nurse, that's correct. Yeah, I showed them a picture of a nurse, and they're quite positive about that form of work. Equally, again, the theme is still there throughout it, so they identify negative aspects. Right? One of them talks about how he doesn't want to work with drunk people, but then they also talk about how they'd like to save people's lives, which is interesting in itself, because they're showing those ideas of compassion that we wouldn't necessarily associate with these young men. So yeah, that comes true. And I guess if I return to the ideas of why they want to do manual work, the young men talked about how they had partial ideas about doing manual work, and then how the school or college would just take them to these carpentry and show them carpentry and show them bricklaying. So they were kind of reinforcing some of these ideas that these young men already had without trying to widen the scope.
Yeah. So
yeah, I guess I think there's potential to, like, as I said, to change these young men's ideas of manhood and their ideas of employment, but there needs to be that rupturing process. I don't want to keep using my ideas, but that rupturing process for me is pivotal to how we do that and expand these young men's ideas. So I talked about showing them different, men that they could identify with, but equally do different forms of employment. So men they could identify with somewhat, but don't do manual forms of work. So they could see themselves in that person and equally think, well, actually that person is similar to me, yet he doesn't do manual work. Maybe there's an option there for me. Hopefully that makes it.
So rupturing process, when you use that term, are you thinking that you're trying to maybe challenge traditional ideas and find and encourage people to look at new ways of looking at things?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's what that rupturing process is. I talk about But it's about changing what is the traditional ideas of manhood. So many of the young men talk about female influences, or how the young man who wants to do cooking, his nan was part of that. The reason why he wanted to do cooking. So I integrate that as part of the eruption process. That these pivotal people changed the ideas of employment and how a traditional man in this area should look and the jobs they should do.
Another question that kind of related to social care or social work was around the way in which people talked about mental health or learning disabilities. So a striking thing about your book was quite a high proportion of the blokes that you talked to were saying that they felt that they had a mental health problem or a learning disability. So I was quite struck by that, because I think, as you observe, there seems to be an increase in the amount of people who would kind of give themselves that diagnosis. So what did you observe there, and what changes do you think are taking place there?
Yeah, I'd look, maybe I could give the reader, the listener, a glimpse as well, because that was another part that a really reflective part for me. So the young men talked about mental health, and I'll get on to it now, but that was, again, one of the most striking things, because when I grew up in the same area, these young men, mental health was, a dirty word. It wasn't something that people talked about, and it wasn't something that men talked about. And I think that was a reflection of society as well. That the young men didn't talk about this. Men were supposed to be strong, tough, and those traditional ideas of masculinity. Yet those young men did talk about mental health. They were comfortable about having mental health concerns. And as I said, it was a difficult time for me to explore those ideas, because I've often, other listeners might be the same, and I still feel uncomfortable talking about those things, but it's a product of my upbringing rather than my that I'm not concerned about. Quite the opposite, in fact. So yeah, but they were very very concerned about it and open talking about it, thankfully. But as you said, learning disabilities, yeah. But that was another interesting thing, I suppose. They adopted, like, back to that pragmatism. They kind of self-diagnosed, some of them did, that they had learning disabilities, or they did have learning disabilities, some of them. But they adopted what I call this pragmatic approach to a learning disability. So they decided that because they had these learning disabilities, that they weren't very good at certain subjects. So one of them had dyslexia, and he said, well, that means that I'm not very good at reading, so I won't bother reading because I'm naturally not going to be good at it. But because I've got dyslexia, I'm going to be good at art. So, yeah, I don't know. That was another difficult topic for me to look into, because I'm severely dyslexic myself, so I know those difficulties. But equally, because I wasn't diagnosed till I was older in life, that didn't affect me. I didn't adopt that pragmatic approach that they didn't, which, so I don't know. There's some difficulties here, I think.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that come out of that, I guess. So in relation to maybe help seeking, I suppose there's some positive messages in that it sounds like the young men are more willing to talk about things like mental health issues and to seek help potentially from people like youth workers or social care workers or social workers. But then there's also the danger from what you're talking about in the sense that sometimes it can be used as a kind of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy to sort of steer themselves away from particular types of employment or opportunities. So what would the answer to that be, you think, in terms of if you were doing youth work? Are there ways to maybe get people to think in a more rounded way, or in a way that doesn't limit them around, say, learning disabilities, for example?
Yeah, I talk about it in the book, and I got quite worried about writing the books, and I'm not sure some of my ideas will fit with some people, but I talk about how we need to think about more about these young men and talk about, like, the way that these behaviour, these certain learning disabilities they might be benefits, and again, I use that loosely. So, how could we kind of channel those some of the associated behaviours that come from these, ADHD, or, and we could use them in a positive way. Maybe that doesn't come across right, but using them to kind of help these young men rather than using them in a negative fashion. And as I said, it was quite difficult for me, because I didn't want to disregard the difficulties myself, because I experienced them myself. But I also, as you said, it lowers their life chances and their aspirations in some ways. So I would like to see us kind of maybe more try to explore more about what the kind of benefits are, as I use that loosely, whilst recognising that there's also difficulties, I suppose.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you ever so much for taking the time to talk to us. Can I just ask, before we finish, where could people get your book if they're interested?
So the book is in all good bookstores, actually. But I guess the main distributor is Emerald Publications. It's open access as well, so if you want to read it electronically, it's free, but it's on other publishers' websites as well. So
So if you want to just have a look at it and you're curious, you can download it for free and have a look at it that way. But if you're one of the old-fashioned people like me who prefers to have a book in your hand, then you can still get it from bookshops as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Rich, for coming in, and great to hear from you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Exchange Wales podcast. At Exchange Wales, we connect researchers, practitioners, and people with lived experience to share evidence, practice, and insights that shape social care. Our work spans children's and adult social care, and we're also exploring the growing role of artificial intelligence in the sector. If you'd like to learn more or get involved, please visit exchangewales.org.